Hey, hi everyone, welcome to the teaching on Saturday. Refuge in the Three Jewels, led by Venerable Tenzin Gache. Thank you so much, Venerable, for offering this teaching to us. Venerable Gache was born in the US, in the Boston area. He's currently ordained, he's an ordained member of the Sangha, and he's pursuing his Gache degree at the Saraje Monastery in Payapupe. So over to you, Venerable.
Okay, thank you. Welcome, everybody. I'm very sorry to be late. Some confusion about the change of time. Now I'm here. We've all been meditating while I was gone, right? If anybody got enlightened in the meantime, feel free to leave. No, we don't need to be here anymore. But if you still need teachings, we can begin. So,
Sorry.
do you usually start with some kind of prayers before? Has that been the standard? Which ones do you usually do?
Yeah, we do the
Dedication.
yeah.
Okay, 34, I think. It's 34. In the verse. Okay. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. My practice of giving and other perfections may become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings be inseparable from the happiness that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. Reverently I prostrate with my body, speech, and mind. I present clouds of every type of offering, actual and imagined. I declare all my negative actions accumulated since beginningless time, and rejoice in the merit of all holy and ordinary beings. Please remain unto the end of cyclic existence and turn the wheel of Dharma for living beings. I dedicate my own merits and those of others to the great enlightenment. Aji Hogi Juk Ching Meido Namri Kabli Ni De Gyamba Za Ge Do Me De Bu Pa Ge No Na Da Ge La Shiva Johiram Gohana Mandalagam Hriya. Okay. So why don't we start with a few minutes of just quiet sitting, and then we can we begin the talk. Okay. So it looks like we're starting new module this week, is that right? Refuge. So as I understand it, we're going through the discovering Buddhism and then kind of overview of some of the subjects. So I think actually, I was looking at the FBMT, the course material, and what they suggest anyway, I've never done this in a course, and I don't know if it's a tradition here, but what they suggest at the beginning is to introduce everybody. I don't know if we need to do that formally, but they suggest asking people what they think about refuge, and maybe that's a good idea, so I have an idea of where people are. I don't know the level of the students. I know some of you, but even the ones I know, I'm not sure exactly how much you've studied. So, anyone want to venture a guess as what we mean by refuge in Buddhism?
Surrender. To surrender.
To surrender. To surrender body and mind completely. To what?
Buddha.
Buddha. Okay.
Love.
Anyone else have a thought?
Taking shelter for the guidance to lead our own lives.
Shelter, guidance. Yeah. Yeah. How to lead your life. So there's a quotation that's given from the sutra in the context of refuge. And it says, Jipe chape minamni tacher vidana naktrutam. Well, there's no need for me to recite it all in Tibetan because you won't know what I'm saying. It's basically saying people who are frightened in the world, for the most part, they go for refuge to mountains or to forests, places, secluded places. But that's not the real, that's not the main refuge. That's not the best refuge, right? So we can think about it first in that kind of analogy, and that's how we might start. Is refuge a uniquely Buddhist practice? And that's actually a point that we debate. What does it mean to be a refuge? But generally, we understand it that it's not uniquely Buddhist. What's uniquely Buddhist is going refuge to the three jewels of Buddhism: Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And so usually people go for refuge, meaning they're looking for protection, is how we understand it in English anyway, refuge. Right? Shelter, you mentioned that term. And there's also the idea of direction or guidance, which is actually, in some sense, more relevant and more accurate in the Buddhist context. But in terms of the worldly context, usually it's talking about protection. Right? So it's recognizing, first of all, that there's something that is threatening, that you cannot face yourself, and thereby going for protection to something that's more powerful than you, or to a place that allows you to avoid that danger. So the idea people go for refuge to mountains and to forests. The point is people who are frightened, they go and hide. Right? But really the point here is that we recognize something as threatening, and we want to look for something that's actually a more stable way to be free of that. Right? So if you're in trouble with the law, well, I suppose if you're in trouble with the law, maybe the best thing to do, if you're really just thinking about your own benefit, is to go to the forest. If you don't want to go to jail, otherwise it's about not much help or recourse unless you can defend yourself in court. But the point is, we want to look for something that's going to we have to think clearly about where we go before we go there. We don't just flee to the first thing that comes to our mind, the easiest thing. So most of us aren't in acute danger in that way. We're not fleeing from our country. I don't believe most of you here are refugees from another country. You see, we use the word refugee. So we have to think. We have to actually give some thought to the kind of danger. That's the first step of understanding refuge, is understanding what is meant by danger here. But at the same time, in a looser sense, we can talk about how people, in general, spend most of their time going for refuge, one way or the other. Right? In the sense that we're always trying to change our situation. We're always doing something. Very few people just sit and do nothing, even if what they're doing is simply going to work or even just going to eat. You wouldn't get accomplished much and wouldn't live very long if you just sat in one place all day. So we have to look at the behavior of people. It's actually very educational to think. It's kind of psychology and analytical meditation for us, that we look at what are people doing with their lives, how are they living, and that's what we then reflect that on ourselves. So how am I doing with my time? But sometimes it's helpful to look at other people too, because it's sometimes easier to see these patterns in other people. So as I said, it's quite a reasoned process for most of us, but there is also, so it's interesting, the first person when asked about refuge was talking about surrender. Now, there's a lot more to refuge in Buddhism, and it has a lot to do with as I say, a reasoned analysis and use of your own volition and your own abilities. It's not simply handing over to somebody else. But at the same time, we definitely see for some people, there's a kind of what we call conversion experience, either from the teachings, but oftentimes from a particular person. And that's not discounted in Buddhism either. And I'll talk a little bit later about this, what I think I often mention in my talks, is this idea that it's more important to come to certainty through one's own analysis rather than through relying on a person and being impressed by them. But at the same time, that can be a very powerful force. And in some sense, without that, it can sometimes be hard to really develop a strong sense of certainty in the teachings. Because we can use all kinds of reasoning, but in a lot of ways, a lot of the reasoning, at least that I use, that we talk about in the monastery and that we teach to people, has to do with examining doubts, examining what reason this couldn't be possible, examining why do we think there can't be a Buddha. But to really prove that there's a Buddha just by pure reasoning is pretty difficult. It's very helpful and supportive to actually encounter somebody that we think this person might actually be enlightened. Otherwise, it can seem very much like fantasy, and that's in the tradition. It's basically understood to be essential in the end. That it says once the teachings have died out, they don't revive. It requires somebody enlightened coming into the world, right? So that if there was ever a time when there were no more practitioners in the world, and then somebody just discovered a Buddhist book, they get some benefit out of it, but they wouldn't be able to get enlightened just from the book. They'd have to connect with a pure lineage of people who trace back to an enlightened master, and who some of them are practicing themselves and achieving something at the present time. So when we look at the very first instance of refuge, it's somewhat like this idea of surrender, actually. Some of you might know the story of the 5 disciples, the 5 ascetics who were traveling with the Buddha for many years, and then, or the Siddhartha, I should say, the young prince, the young former prince, who was practicing asceticism. They rejected him because he started taking food. And then when he had his enlightenment experience and came back to them, they conspired that they would not show any signs of respect for him because he had given up the path. But it said when they came near to him, they could not help themselves. They were overwhelmed. And even though they had made this pledge and had the intention not to honor him, they just naturally made a seat for him and showed signs of respect. And it said when they asked what has happened, and the Buddha said that I have discovered this nectar, was the analogy he used. Then their hair fell out. I mean, I think they were already ascetic, but maybe they had long hair. But it says that their hair fell out, and they all just spontaneously were wearing golden robes, saffron robes, and they were ordained. So those are the first 5 Buddhist monks, and the first 5 Buddhists to take refuge. It just happened quite spontaneously. Then the Buddha taught them about the Four Noble Truths. So this actually happened before he even began teaching. All right, so that's the kind of power. In Tibetan, we call that ji, or CG. I'm not sure of the Sanskrit. It definitely comes from a Sanskrit word. Ji means like radiance or brilliance. Right, this the brilliance of the person. The how do we say? Charisma. We can even say, yeah, charisma of the person is, and then in Tibetan they use the word zilginenpa, which means like, you can say overpowering. It really means outshining. It's like standing in front of the sun. You can't deny that it's quite powerful. Actually, I think you wouldn't be thinking of anything else if you were standing in front of the sun. You might not last long. So that happened then, but some people still have that kind of experience today. And some of us who were fortunate to meet great masters have similar experiences, not quite as intense. I don't know anybody whose hair fell out and was spontaneously wearing saffron robes, but I've seen people have pretty rapid changes in pretty strong conversion, we could say. And sometimes it's quite stable. In some sense, it's actually often more stable if that kind of thing happens than if it just happens through pure thought process. But at the same time, it's really important also to stabilize that, because for some people, we can say that karma is different and there's different things that ripen. But if somebody's really devoted to a teacher, that's a very strong basis for having a lifelong practice, it would appear. So, okay, so we're now, what was the last module that you went through before Refuge? You just finished. It was karma. Yeah, that's right. So it's interesting. In the Lamrim, the order is reversed, right? In the Lamrim, you start with Refuge and then you go on to karma. But in the Discovering Buddhism, you start with karma. In either case, so just to orient ourselves, we can say, we talk about the Lamrim, the stages of the path, is a very helpful way of sort of structuring the practice and having some sense of just having some sense of where we are. So we think I've studied this much, I'm going on to this, and so forth. We can have an idea of why these subjects are coming up. So this occurs in what we call the lower capable being, right? Which is the more preliminary reflections. Now it sounds a bit derogatory in English, but the idea is it's the lower reflections, right? It's not that people who are studying this are inferior. The point is that this is the basis we can think about. Like you're building a building, you have to start by building the ground floor. There's no use in trying to build the top floor without having foundation. So a lot of this has to do with coming to terms with the reality of our situation, thinking about what are we doing here and where are we going, stepping back from just concerns of everyday life. So, in the Lamrim, I think the reason that refuge comes first is it's understood that that is the entryway or entering the Buddhist teaching. What makes you a Buddhist is defined as whether or not you have refuge, which means that you basically, it means that you accept, in the sense that you adhere to the position, you'd say, that the three jewels are a valid refuge, are the valid refuge, and that nothing else is perfect in that way. Valid in the sense not just of being temporarily valid, but in something that actually has the power to free you from suffering completely. So that's all it defines. That's all that's necessary to be considered a Buddhist. Sometimes it talks about also accepting the four seals, which are philosophical standpoints that define a Buddhist. But it said that that's what philosophically makes somebody a Buddhist. And so somebody can be a Buddhist without necessarily having that philosophy, in the sense that some people just aren't philosophically oriented. But if somebody really wants to go deeply into the practice, it's really necessary to understand the four seals also, which is very briefly is to understand that all compounded things are impermanent. All contaminated things, which means things that arise out of the power of karma. All contaminated things are in the nature of suffering. And then to understand that all things that exist are empty and selfless. And finally, that nirvana is true peace. That, yes?
Sorry, what do you mean by compounded in the first seal?
Compounded means things that arise from causes and conditions. Yeah. It's a good question. Yeah, so anything that comes from a cause has to be impermanent. It's just the nature of things. If it was permanent, then because the cause it's dependent on something else for its existence. It's dependent on the cause. So it just, as long as the cause and the conditions are right for it to still be there, it will still be there. Or it'll sustain its continuum, we say. It's still changing moment to moment, but once those conditions are no longer present, it won't be there. And there's no conditions that can last forever. If there were, then those would have to have conditions that could last forever, and an infinite cycle, and then everything would have to last forever. So that doesn't work. So that's the starting point. And then karma is then reflected on afterwards. It's a more complicated subject, thinking about karma. But I think in discovering Buddhism, it's presented first, because if you've really reflected well on karma, then the refuge will be more powerful. Now, in some sense, all of these topics in the Lamrim that we go through, they're all interdependent also. So it's not as though you first master refuge, then you master karma, and then you master renunciation, then you master bodhicitta. It's not like that. The stronger the other ones become, the beginning ones will become stronger as well. It's just a matter of thinking about it in this kind of order. But it is useful to recognize that it's not a strict order. What actually happens in your mind is not necessarily going to be what's written in the Lamrim. I'm not actually aware of anyone who's had that exact experience. You have to be present with your own development and be open to what kind of experiences you're going to have. But at the same time, it's very useful to structure your thought process. Otherwise, we can learn all kinds of teachings and they don't stay in the mind. It's understood in terms of training one's memory. A very useful tool for that is to create a kind of deposit, what's we say. I mean, a kind of organization within your mental space. And so there's even methods that are trained in, such as visualizing a house and then visualizing different people in different parts of the house that are representing different things that you're trying to remember. And so you structure it in that way, and then it's much easier. So if we've studied the Lamrim, and then you have refuge, and you know what's after refuge is karma, and you know after karma, then you talk about the measure of having attained the being of this lower capacity and so forth. Then anytime you receive a teaching, you can file it away in the proper place, and then it all comes comes into your mind very spontaneously. So, for example, in my case, we studied Refuge in the 5th year of the program at Sarah J. It's even though it's the basic thing, it was only in the 5th year that we finally studied that. So we have the outlines of that, right? So before I was here today, actually, when Anshuman called me and I wasn't aware that the teaching was starting, I had just sat down half an hour before the teaching and I was just thinking over what it says in the book. I don't even have the book with me, but it's all kind of in the same place. I know what the different subjects, and I was able to think about what I want to say. So if all of the information I had, I've learned over 20 years as a monk and also more years practicing Buddhism, was all just in a disorganized fashion, then it would be very harder for me to pull it out and put it together and to a coherent talk. But if it's all stowed away in its proper order, then that becomes a lot easier. And also when we're thinking about, when we're doing contemplations about things. So if I'm sitting and meditating, even if while I'm meditating on refuge, I realize that my mind needs to focus more on the truth of suffering, I can just move over to that and then think about what truth of suffering is about and what are the outlines of the truth of suffering and what are the different topics. Right? So it's all available for us when we need it to be. That's the advantage of this stepwise manner. But we also don't want to get so attached to it that we just expect it all to happen that way, or then don't recognize the value of things some people have cultivated where it doesn't follow that manner. So somebody comes in and has this great experience, and then we say, no, that you can't have that experience yet because you didn't study the lower capable beings, so it must not be authentic. Sometimes it's good to look at what's happening and recognize that people are coming into this with different imprints also. So these first disciples of the Buddha, it's understood that was the reason that happened. Was like everything, it was an interdependent process. It wasn't just spontaneous. It had been developing over many lifetimes. We just don't see the whole background to it. So it seems all of a sudden. So, okay. So what the first question, Venerable Legdin had put out together some outlines of how we might go through these subjects. So the first question was, why do we seek refuge, right? The most simple answer is that we all want happiness and don't want suffering. That's the most basic point of any kind of psychology, not just human psychology, animal psychology, to be ghost psychology if you believe in ghosts. Right? Every being is always pursuing happiness and trying to avoid suffering. And in some sense, any kind of pursuit of happiness is a kind of pursuit of refuge. It's wishing. So if we're too cold, we want to go into a warm home, a warm building. That's a kind of refuge. If we're hungry, we want to go for refuge in taking food. We want to be something that will assuage the hunger. So we don't always think about it, and other than human beings, most animals don't give it a lot of thought. Just follow what we call instinct. It's quite an interesting process in and of itself, what instinct really is. But the point is, the general understanding of instinct is that they're not really critically analyzing what would be the most conducive way to find happiness. They're just following what is habitual. So as human beings, fortunately, we have a little bit more freedom to think about these things. And also, for a lot of us, fortunately, we have the space to do so. And some people just don't, even if they're human beings, they don't have much space in their time to think about much more than survival. So fortunate if we can do that. And another reason we might go for refuge is a feeling of insecurity. And so insecurity is a sense that although things are okay right now, my immediate survival is not threatened, this isn't permanent. There's something I'm not standing on stable ground. So sometimes that can be a vague feeling, sometimes there can be reasons behind it. It's a common thing that's talked about also in modern psychology. And sometimes it's seen as a fault. You're insecure, you want to become secure. Different ways to do that. But in Buddhism, actually, that can be a good start. Being insecure is a good start to a spiritual path. So it said that there's the three major obstacles to entering and then following correctly a spiritual path. And the first one is not wishing to go, not wishing to change, right? Which happens when we feel too secure. Life is pretty good. Everything's okay. Why would I want to make any big changes in my life? And I was thinking about that walking over here today. There's so many people on the road, as there always are, everywhere. How many people came here tonight? Not so many. Most of them I was thinking, well, it's not that long of a talk, but probably they have better things to do. So most of us feel, why would I want to spend my time pursuing a spiritual path? My life is pretty much okay. There's something else I'd rather do. I'd rather go out with my friends and spend time with my family, whatever other activities you might do on a Saturday night. So we want to first have a sense that something's not right. There's something more that we need. And that sometimes has to come from suffering. I mean, not sometimes, actually always, but sometimes in the sense that sometimes it has to be inspired by a lot of suffering. So some of the famous examples in the Buddhist texts is people like Milarepa. Some of you might have heard of him, right? He was very ripe for spiritual practice, we could say, right? Some of you might know the story of Milarepa as a young man to avenge the wrong done to his mother. He murdered 35 people. So it said that, or he said, it's quite a poignant statement. He said, when I stayed home, I wished I had gone out. When I went out, I wished I had stayed home. Right? Sometimes we feel that way. Everything we do, it doesn't feel right. The kind of anxiety about things. You're never comfortable with what you're doing. So that came from this deep regret he had, you could say, or just heaviness about what had happened. So he was very ripe and ready to go through a lot. So that's a really good start. Now, for a lot of people, unfortunately, that doesn't lead anywhere. And I was just talking about this a few days ago in a talk over back at Sarah. Right, so a lot of people, that's about where their spiritual path ends. They want to do something, but they choose something that's not really in line with spiritual principles. Right, they just seek thrills, or take medication, or something else that those may be two opposites, but the idea is that they're trying to change the way they feel, but they're just without really thinking about some kind of deep transformation. So if you're seeking a thrill, then you feel, we'd say, high for the period of time that you're doing that. It's taking you outside of yourself. Most of us want to get outside of ourselves, our sense of, because it said that, when I didn't mention this, but when he says you don't want to go, what it's really talking about is adherence to a stable self. So the conception of an inherent self. And you have a sense that you're independent and solid, and there's no need to change, nothing to change. So for a lot of people then who want to, we say, get outside of themselves, this is a common expression, they try to do something that takes them outside of their ordinary thought process. Right? But it often doesn't last, or sometimes it's actually detrimental. So then the other, I mentioned medication, or just any kind of any kind of conventional form of we say psychotherapy or something like that, where the goal isn't so much, and it's not to say this is the case for all psychotherapy, but the point here is if one's goal is not so much to transform, but just to kind of make things okay such that you can function and just not have to think so much about the difficulties that you're experiencing, finding ways of coping, you say. Right? Some forms of psychotherapy are actually what do you say? Their intention is to create some kind of transformation. And some of them seem to be more successful than others. That's a different question. But in any case, I think whatever we do, that's not enough. I don't know of any psychotherapy, maybe there is out there, but not aware of so many, where the goal is final enlightenment or liberation from samsara. Right? And it's questionable whether that could be achieved simply through therapeutic process, right? The idea here is that you have to take responsibility in yourself. You have to become stable and sort of understanding your own inner processes. Like I'm sure many of you have seen this book by Lama Zopa, Becoming Your Own Therapist, right? It's a great title. That's exactly what we want to do in Buddhist practice. We want to work with all of the difficult aspects of our own minds. And it's not that you don't enter spiritual practice. That's exactly what I was saying with Milarepa, because everything is good and happy in your life, and you're a well-functioning person. And sometimes that has to break down a bit. So even if that is the case, if you really want to move forward in the practice, sometimes that has to break down. So then, okay, so we're talking about why we're seeking refuge. Then we talk about, so there's a couple of the reasons. I mentioned wishing for happiness and wanting to avoid suffering, feeling insecure. Another reason that's talked about in the text is imprints, right? Bakjak, it says in Tibetan. So that means essentially you had the habit of doing so before in a past life. So for some people, that this might actually be more natural, and they might actually have a natural sense of why we go for refuge, and they see a teacher and they just immediately have this spontaneous sense of surrender, as it was mentioned at the beginning. Well, I'll talk about that more later. And then one other thing I thought to mention, sometimes this is seen as a fault, right? So in some psychological systems that I know, for example, Freud had this opinion that people who go for refuge in religions, it's really in a kind of escapism, right? Which maybe for some people it is, I don't know. But I'm a little skeptical. I think I'm generally quite positive about religion in general. I'm sure, and there are definitely extremes of it that I don't support, but I think it has to be done in a healthy way, where we're not just making projections or exaggerating what the teachings can do for us, right? But there's also an understanding that there's something more, and I think one of the issues with some modern understandings of mind is that they don't account for the possibility that the mind can actually be transformed, and there can actually be very healthy ways of surrendering yourself to somebody else or to a teaching, and even not so much to another person, but especially to a principle and to a greater, something that's greater that you're seeking. So we talked about what is refuge. The examples were like, surrender and looking for security. So the word Kyabje in Tibetan, so the Western translator, Alex Berzin, he translated this as safe direction, which actually I think I don't use that translation. I usually just say refuge because it's the standard one. But I think that's very useful to think about because it's essentially what it's saying. Kyabje in Tibetan means, kyab is refuge, or literally a cap, if it's not in the context of of meaning the word refuge, and it is in Tibet. Also, if you go for as a refugee in another country, they use the word cap, but it also means like a roof or an overhang. So if you have a rock that secludes you, that's called a cap. It's something that protects you. It's a safety. And then dro means go. It's going in that direction. So this idea of safe direction is a very useful way to think about it. That we think about where am I going with my life, and then thinking about what is a better direction that I can go in. What do I want to actually attain? Going in the direction of that. This gives some substance to what we're talking about. So it's not just I need safety, and this person, these teachings make a lot of sense, but it's understanding that this is it's a goal. It's not just a place, and it's not just something immediate. It's thinking that if I want to, thinking very long term, where do I want to be in 20 years? It's a good first start. And then we think about this, we talk about in the lower capable being, the idea is where do I want to be in my next life? We're going in some kind of direction. Maybe you talked about this in talking about Dharma, that we're going, for better or worse, we're creating the direction that we're going. We're headed somewhere. And everything we do is contributing to that, is contributing to where we're going. So oftentimes that's quite uncontrolled, because we're not really thinking so much about the long-term consequences of things, right? People, to use a normal, ordinary example, right? Every time we eat, we're having an effect on our health. In the long term, that's going to have a lot of consequences for better or worse. But most people, when they eat, that's not what they're thinking. Some people are more conscientious, but most of the time, people are eating because it's something tastes good now, or because it's what socially is appropriate to eat right now. And so it's almost like we're blind to the process of what we're creating, but we are creating it. So when we think more long term, we can actually be more proactive about doing something now that will have positive consequences in the long run. And then we can structure that as a particular goal, not just that we want to do all the good we can do now and hope that there's some good result, but actually there's a particular goal we're striving for. And there are practical ways to reach that. And that's I think for me, as I mentioned, being generally very positive about religion, but the reason I would say, one of the reasons at least, that I chose Buddhism, because it wasn't something I was raised to believe or to practice, is that it was all very clear. It makes it very clear what you should practice, what is the purpose of this. It's not presented as any kind of dogma, or that it's just you have to have faith and it will just work. It's not, in a lot of ways, it's not an emotional religion. It doesn't appeal to our emotions, although certain parts of it certainly do. But overall, the structure, if you look at the Buddha's life, it was structured, as I say the word structure, it was structured in a very clear, cohesive way. Now I'm teaching this, now I'm teaching this, right? A lot of other religions, it seems that, like actually even my teacher in college mentioned this to me. He himself was a Christian, but he pointed out that you have the image of the Buddha sitting there in peace, whereas in Christianity we have the image of Christ on the cross. It's very confrontational. But in Buddhism, it's not so much appealing to the emotions, it's just showing us this is a method, this is a way that we can practice. Buddha's famous saying of, I teach you the method, but it's up to you to practice it. It's very, very rational in that way. Okay, so then the next question that was put here is it instinctual going for refuge? Is it instinctual to go for refuge? So there, in some sense, there's two ways to think about that. One is that our natural inclination to go for happiness, that is very much instinctual. And instinctual just means something that we don't have to cultivate, essentially, habitual. There are habits that we have from various causes. But unless, as I mentioned, unless somebody has very strong imprints towards Buddhist practice per se, particularly from our previous lifetime, then for most people, they have to intentionally cultivate this sense of refuge. You have to think about the reasons. So I mentioned to begin with that what makes you a Buddhist is going for refuge. And what makes you a Buddhist philosophically is accepting the four seals. But at a certain point, we really have to use philosophy or use reasoned analysis. It doesn't mean you necessarily have a degree in philosophy or something like that. But the point is, you just have to think about things. You have to think. It's not just going to come naturally. It often goes against the way that we usually think about things. We might have a lot of ideas about it. All of us have various things that we've learned about religion here and there, and they may or may not be correct. And it's the ones that are more correct, we want to enhance those and strengthen them. So it really needs to be cultivated. So then the next point is disadvantages and disappointments of worldly refuge. Right? So first of all, I don't think I gave a specific definition of what is refuge. This is something that we talked about quite a bit in our debates, and there's no clear answer, but one person suggested that a refuge is something that there is somebody who goes to it for refuge. It's a bit of a tautology, but that's essentially, it's pretty close to the right answer, I think. I would just add the caveat that it's not simply that it's something that by entrusting oneself to it, it has the ability to free one from some degree of danger, or something that they want to avoid, or something to give what they want. And so if it's just a complete fantasy, it's a question whether it's a real refuge. But even so, sometimes going for refuge to imagine things can be helpful to a certain extent. But in terms of real things that exist, it's something that if it has some ability to assuage our suffering. So the most simple one is just pleasure, right? Just pursuing pleasure. It's, as I said before, essentially what pursuing pleasure is a kind of going for refuge. So when we talk about the disadvantages and disappointments of that, I'm not sure I need to talk too much about it. It's very useful to reflect on it again and again, but I expect if most of you are here, you probably have some inkling that's probably not the only way or the best way to free yourself from suffering. And the major disadvantage is that it doesn't last. The second major disadvantage is that it often creates more problems, and it can be addictive. So if it didn't last, but it had no further problems, you could just do it again and again and be okay. But I mean, we can use extreme examples because it's illustrative. Things like alcohol, right? For most people, it's pretty obvious that the disadvantages of alcohol, and it's certainly something that people turn to for refuge. But there are very few people who would actively give a philosophical reason why going for alcohol is a valid refuge, right? Because it has obvious consequences in the short term and the long run. But in some sense, that's just an extreme example of the same pattern that most of us follow when we're pursuing pleasure. So then there are what we call maybe deeper things. So things like relationships or family. And for a lot of people, that's where it ends. They would say that I'm not a superficial person. I don't just like pleasures. I really have family values, and it's considered a very socially appropriate thing and something that is admirable. Right? It's certainly better than a lot of things. But is it the final end? I mean, as Buddhist monks, we always think back to the example of the Buddha himself. What example was he setting when he walked out on his wife and his son? He named his son burden. I don't know. I'm wondering. People say that the word Rahula implies a kind of burden, although honestly, in Tibetan, the Drang Chempa does not imply that. That's his name. Say not Drang Chempa. And Drachin. Yeah. But anyway, this is what I was told when I was young. I sometimes repeat things that without thinking about where they came from, but it's an interesting point that the Buddha, when he had a son, essentially, whether the name meant that or not, that he recognized this as just another burden, something that was tying him to the lifestyle, because he was already very much intent on leaving his lifestyle when his son was born. So as monastics, that is certainly how what we train in viewing things as. We train in seeing that family life is in so many ways can be repressive, can be a kind of prison. It's not to say that, you know, for lay people, it's actually probably good in a lot of cases to have families. If nobody did, then, you know, Buddhism would not be here anymore, right? After a generation, and the whole world wouldn't function. If we can raise children in a good way, it's actually be a very good contribution to the world. I can also say that myself, that I, for many years, was resistant to and trying to avoid the possibility of being given a young boy student. But now that I have one, I see the value of it, and I can see that you have to. It's very good practice for putting aside what I want every moment, right? And also thinking that if you invest in something, invest in a young person, then they're going to make a contribution beyond just your lifetime. So if we can see it that way, it can be very positive, right? But what we're talking about more here, this kind of refuge, is the sense that we do it as a way of making ourselves happy, right? And if that is the goal, it's not going to do that in the long run. It'll give us some kind of happiness, but it also won't last, and it's very unstable. So we see the torment people go through when they lose partners, when they lose children. It's often a lot worse than anything people experience when they don't have that in the first place. So another point here, though, is that if that was final liberation, then most people in the world would be liberated. We have to examine that carefully. And because in some sense, some of us might have that idea. And also for me, early on, I can admit that before I became a monk, it was a long thought process to really think, is it really the case that ordinary people who have, not just people who are in dysfunctional families, but people who have happy family lives aren't happy? Because this is what the Buddha taught. But is that really true? Is it just, sometimes we might think, well, maybe it's just me trying to justify what I'm doing. We have to really examine closely so it's good to look at examples of people, and look at the problems that can come out of it. But the essential point is that even if life is stable and happy, it's not the final goal. It's not the best that things can get, and it never lasts. That's just impossible. Right? So you can imagine just having a happy family until you die, and then just suddenly have a heart attack and it's all over, and there was no precipitating factor, so you didn't actually have any suffering. Right? That's pretty rare, but even if that does happen, right, it's the end. Now, if we just believe in one lifetime, this is also another important question. That might seem like a reasonable goal, but if we think about multiple lifetimes, then what do you take with you from that? What if what you did lasts? If you were a kind person and treated your family well, that's a good start, right? But simply the enjoyment you had won't come with you, and maybe the sense of sort of pride that we can have. A lot of people, that's how they define themselves. I'm a successful person in my business, and I have a good family. But that doesn't come with you in the end. So that actually leads on to the next point is worldly success. Right. So that's another kind of worldly refuge. People think that if I become successful in life, that will be stability. Now that's of course fraught with its own problems. There's the famous saying, at least I'd imagine most of you know this, Oscar Wilde, the great English playwright and writer. Right? The only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about. So the point is, it's somewhat in line with Buddhist principles. If we're not famous, we want to be famous. If we're famous, we wish we weren't famous anymore, because it brings all of its own problems. As soon as we're successful, there's going to be the suffering of being successful. You don't have time. You don't have any free time. You're always busy. You're always people that are always trying to contact you. If you're really successful, you can't even walk down the street because there'll be a crowd forming around you. A lot of people think that's great. I would like to have that experience, but when it actually happens, a lot of people complain about it. They say this makes my life miserable. I can't just blend in, go where I want, have a normal life. No, I think it is also good to have the motivation to be successful. And sometimes people think that Buddhism means that we should that because you don't want to have any desire, you should just wish to not achieve anything, right? That's a misunderstanding, essentially. Buddhism talks about desire as being as an affliction. It's really talking about attachment, which means exaggerating the qualities of objects. But actually, we do want to have a kind of ambition, but we want to have ambition for the right things. So if you're in the world and your ambition is to make the world a better place, that's a pretty good ambition. And it's probably good to follow through with that. So we'll get to that. But if the ambition is simply to make money for its own sake or to have status, that's in Buddhism maybe not such an excellent goal, although it's not necessarily bad either. We could say it's not necessarily virtuous or not virtuous. It could be just neutral, right? Again, it really depends on what we do with it in the end. But if we see it, so that's what we talk about attachment, we exaggerate it. We think that is happiness. That is the ultimate goal of life. Then that becomes non-virtue because it's based on a misapprehension, and it will inevitably lead to suffering because it's the wrong apprehension of what is actually possible and what the qualities of something. So then another important point to mention here, other kinds of worldly refuge, is what we sometimes call cults, right? So it manifests as a kind of spiritual path, right? And sometimes it's very hard to distinguish these things. What is it? How do we really define a cult? It's actually quite difficult. A few years ago, in 2020, back during the lockdown, we were at Kopan Monastery, and Lama Zopa Rinpoche was giving a talk in Tibetan to the monks at Kopan. So he said that, I think he was talking about Buddhism. He said, if we're not careful, people will think we're a cult. He was saying this in Tibetan, but he said the word cult in English. And then he asked, how do you say cult? So he asked me, and I said, Chulagnyampa, which means like an evil or wicked religion, right? I don't know how else to say it. So Rinpoche liked that. He found it funny, but how do we even define that, right? But the problem is, I think it's unusual that a cult is so overtly negative. And of course, there might be some that explicitly say our intention is to make the world, create what's that?
Anarchist.
Well, anarchism, yeah, that's a different question also. Well, but even in the case of anarchism, I believe a lot of people who are anarchists are trying to make the world a better place. I knew some of them in college, and they strongly believed that their position was actually going to benefit the world. right? As opposed to actively saying our intention is to make chaos and make the world a terrible place, right? Even somebody who is a terrorist, that's probably not what they really say to their followers. We're trying to improve things. This is the only method. This is an act of desperation. What we have to do. So this is also, I mentioned the three major obstacles, so I didn't forget about this, although I mentioned one of them, to the spiritual path. One is not wishing to go. The second one is that you want to go, but you take the wrong path. And this is very easy to fall into. If we're not careful, we follow the wrong teacher, and we can actually make things a lot worse. So there are all kinds of things these days. It's not just these days, we say, there's all kinds of things in the past, although what is a little different nowadays is that it's a lot more available to us. It's very easy to access a lot of different things. And in the 1960s and 70s, when Buddhism was first a big fad, at least in Western countries, there weren't that many Buddhist centers, so the ones that there were quite well attended oftentimes. But nowadays, if you think about Buddhism, well, where do you begin? There's so many different possibilities, and there's so many people making contrary claims. And there's very little oversight to it all. It's like I've noticed this now that I've translated a couple of books on Buddhism. Although I pray that I've done so in a way that's accords with the Buddhist tradition, but nobody's really checking. It's not peer reviewed, per se, although I think it ought to be. That's what in the context of that I was thinking. Maybe not everything has to be. Not every scientific book is peer reviewed, but if you want to be able to say you're peer reviewed and to say that you have an endorsement, then you need to have some level of credentials that allows for that. So you have to be very careful with that. And even if we find the right teaching, sometimes, as Lama Zopa Rinpoche was saying, if we're not careful, people will think we're a cult. We have to be careful ourselves. What does it mean? What is the mindset of a cult? What does it mean to? I think one of the trademark factors of it is that you see that people surrender their ability. They relinquish we talked about surrender earlier, but in the negative way, that we surrender our decision making to somebody else. Right? Such that we would, if challenged, we would say, it wasn't my decision. My teacher told me to do it. That's not just in religious cults. That's a big problem in society in general. Following negative governments and just not taking responsibility for their own actions, not using their own ability to think about things. But also, even as we get into any religion, it's good to step back at times and think about what we're doing, think about it from many different angles, so we don't end up relating it to that way. Because we certainly see that even in Buddhism all the time. It's a different extent. Right? We see people surrendering or not using their powers of reasoning, and kind of using it as a kind of crutch for themselves. Because a belief system can be a very powerful crutch, and it can allow us to manage things that are otherwise unmanageable for ourselves. And at the beginning, maybe we need that, but in the long run, we want to be able to stand on our own feet and be able to manage. The purpose of Buddhist practice is to come to terms with our own minds, not to just. That's the way I think I said this at the beginning. Not to just numb it out, but actually work with what's there. So, and I mentioned that we have making the world a better place. That's also can be a kind of worldly refuge, but it's a much more positive one than a lot of other things. People think they want to, what am I going to do with my life and my time? I want to devote myself to improving things for society as a whole. That's really good. And so it's not so much that we want to reject that. The purpose, the understanding in Buddhism is that we have, in order to really accomplish that, except in certain exceptional circumstances, usually we need a lot of help to do that. And this is also a reason for going to refuge. It's actually considered one of the best reasons, is that you recognize that in my current capacity, there's not a lot I can do. And is there a way I can develop myself that I can actually make the world do something that will benefit a lot of people? So, for example, if the biggest problem in the world was that everybody was sick, then you'd probably want to study medicine first before you went out and tended to the sick. So likewise here, we have to build a very strong foundation. And the analogy that's often used is, like, if you're drowning, you're stuck in the ocean with somebody else, there's not a lot you can do until one of you is standing on dry land. Otherwise, you just pull each other down. So this also has to do with seeking an object of refuge that's achieved that, but then wanting to achieve that ourselves. So that actually leads into this next point. This is the next stage, which is talking about the qualities of a perfect refuge. So what kind of qualities are we looking for then? We're looking for a refuge. So I talked about that was the disadvantagement, the disappointment of worldly refuge. And now we talk about the qualities of a perfect refuge, right? So, of course, the example in Buddhism is the Buddha, although teachings, right? I mentioned the three jewels. I think most of you know this, but just in case. And so the three jewels, meaning the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Jewel being is Ratna in Sanskrit, right? Now, the Tibetan is Kunchok, which actually does not. I don't believe the word Ratna has the same connotation, although it's etymologized this way in an Indian text, Uttara Tantra. But it might be a creative etymology, because I'm not sure that the word Ratna can be broken down this way, but I don't know. Some of you might know better than I do. But in Tibetan, Kunchok means rare and sublime, or rare and supreme. Right? So it's something that, so jewel is the English translation. It's a nice analogy. It's something precious, but really we understand it as something that's very rare in the world. Also a jewel, we can think about diamonds are quite rare. And something that's extraordinary. That's not like ordinary things that we experience most of the time. Some things are very rare, but there are very rare diseases also, so not desirable. It's something that is not only hard to find, but once found is superior to everything else. So the three jewels being the Buddha as a teacher, so the Dharma, at least conventionally, we can understand it as the teaching of the Buddha, and then the Sangha, the community. Of course, there's many deeper ways to understand those, but that's the most basic. So when we talk about the qualities of perfect refuge, actually, we start with talking about the Buddha. Even the real refuge is the Dharma. We'll get to that later, but it's important for all to remember that. The Buddha, so it says that, actually, I don't know if any of you know about the stories of the Buddha, that when he would teach, the monks would fold their robes into a throne for him, right? So that at that time there weren't usually seats available, so all the monks had the namjar, was a sangati, I think in Sanskrit. So they would, if there were 500 monks, 500 of them would fold their sangati into a throne. The Buddha would sit on that, and the Buddha would bow to that throne before he sat down, because the understanding was he was bowing to the Dharma. The Buddha didn't bow to any person, but he was bowing to the Dharma, that which, even though it said the Buddha, it came from his mouth, that he taught the Dharma, it wasn't that he invented it. That was how he had become the Buddha, was through the Dharma. But in terms of understanding the perfect refuge, anyway, we talk about the Buddha. So the Buddha is said to be a perfect refuge in 4 ways. So the first is that the Buddha himself, or we could say herself if the person is female, but if we talk about the historical Buddha anyway, we'll talk about he, is free of all fears, meaning free of any anything that's threatening, any kind of possibility of not just suffering, but possibility of suffering, and free of any obstacles or obscurations. There's nothing more to do. That's often what's said in the Buddhist text. We say that even when the Buddha became enlightened, that's what he said, that the work that to be done has been done. There's nothing more to do. It's not like the Buddha can get better and more improved. This is in Tibetan, the word Buddha is translated as Sangha. It implies something that's already everything's been done. Sang means it's purified. It means everything that was needed to be purified has been purified. Ge means flourished. Right? It's already flourished to the maximum extent. There's no more development. So that's what we're looking for, if there is such a thing. If there is such a thing, then why would we want to settle for anything less? We could say, right? If there's something superior to the refuge we're seeking, then we should seek that superior thing. But the Buddha is the most superior. And then secondly, that the Buddha teaches the method to achieve that. Right? So if the Buddha was so superior, it wouldn't benefit us that much if he couldn't teach us a method to get there ourselves. And it would just be like a personality cult, talking about how great the Buddha is, but what does it do for us? But the Buddha did teach a method. It's also, again, I mentioned, part of why, for me, Buddhism was religion of choice, is that it does not have this idea that we see in some religions that the founder is somehow elect or special, that nobody else can be like that. It's quite the opposite. The Buddha not only said you can be, but you should be. That's the goal of the religion. All of us should achieve that same state. And then third, that the Buddha had the compassion to teach to others. And so it said he could know the method, but then he's just tight-fisted with it, doesn't want to tell anybody. It wasn't like that. The Buddha taught this out of compassion for the world. And then finally, that the Buddha is reliable refuge, right? Something that's unchanging, and something that for somebody who doesn't react in relation to how others are, how close or far others are from him, which means basically if somebody is his close family member, if there's somebody he's never met before, if somebody who is trying to help him and making offerings, or somebody who's actively trying to harm him, there's no partiality. It's completely stable that way, unchanging. So that is, we talk about also the causal refuge and the resultant refuge. This is a slightly different subject, and I think it might be touched on later, as in later talk perhaps, but nevertheless, just to give an introduction to it, the understanding is that we can understand the refuge in terms of the person, Buddha, or the Dharma, external to us. This is the causal refuge, something that somebody else has already realized. But there's also the resultant refuge, which is more important ultimately, or really the real refuge, which is what we will achieve. So we talked about safe direction before. We take refuge in the possibility of achieving that state ourselves. And that gives structure and meaning to our lives. So in the same way, we can talk about the qualities of perfect refuge in that way. that we want to be going in the direction of something that really is the best. All the different directions we could go in. This is the best way we could develop ourselves. Okay. So I think the last subject for today, which is quite a broad subject, so it might take a while. Now, I came, 15, 20 minutes late. I'm happy to talk longer if people would like. I don't want to keep you all here if you have places to go, but we don't have to have, at least for me, I'm not fixated on finishing at 7 p.m. So the last topic is how to develop confidence. Right. So I just said the Buddha is perfect and is free of all faults, but that's a pretty bold statement. So what's also really nice about Buddhism, I feel, is that we can really talk about these things. It's not just something that we take on faith. It's not just something that is so sacred that we contaminate it with our speech, right? It's something that we really have to think about. And it's very good if we have questions about it. So I talked about the object of refuge, but there's the Kyabje I mentioned at the beginning, going for refuge. That's some mindset that we're wanting to cultivate. Right. So the definition of that in Tibetan, what is it? Choe Sum Ling, Tara Lekyope Nupa, Ning Tapale Lo Lingi Gyurjing, Damche La Kelampe Raptu Chepe Riksunepa. So the three jewels, so actually you have to read it backwards. I'll go backwards because Tibetan goes the opposite direction from English. So it's something that abides in the class, meaning there's three different kinds, and I'll explain it in a minute, of an adherence or a entrusting oneself to, Damcha is very hard to translate in English. We could say thesis, but that doesn't sound right here. So it's entrusting to the certainty, well, I could say belief. It's not quite right, but the confidence, we could say, the confidence that is not just superficial. It's lo lingi gyur in Tibetan, means that it's like a fundamental shift in your mind. And it ning tapani means from the bottom of your heart. That the three jewels have the power to free you from suffering. It's essentially the point. So I said it abides in the class. So actually it said there's three kinds of refuge. There's physical, verbal, and mental refuge. And all those are refuge. Right? So physically making prostrations is the kind of going for refuge. And then saying the words, I go for refuge, is the kind of going for refuge. But then there's also the mental one, which is this entrusting your mind, confidence in this. So we have to develop this kind of confidence. It's not something that just happens spontaneously in most cases. And even if it does, we should develop it further. So one of the great masters of our tradition, Kyabje Lama, some of you know Kyabje, is the student of Tsongkhapa. He puts it as when you understand the reasons for going for refuge, and you understand through valid establishment and reasoning what the objects of refuge are, then every time you go for refuge, it has the power to overturn the mountain of cyclic existence. But if you don't really have a clear, stable sense of what this is that you're going to refuge for, what are these objects? And although you say the words again and again, I go for refuge, it doesn't really fulfill this definition of going for refuge. So we have to really know what it is. What are we talking about? So I said I would talk about this point again, this idea of the people who follow reasoning versus people who follow a person. And it's encouraged you to have this reasoned approach. And this is also another point of debate, because there's a kind of paradox here. So it says that a person who follows reasoning, person who takes this kind of approach, is somebody who won't accept something until they ascertain it through valid cognition. Right? But the thing is, if that means we don't actually go for refuge to the Buddha until we ascertain with certainty that he is a Buddha, that he is an awakened being. That's a pretty advanced realization. Right? To really understand, some of you may have heard this term emptiness. Right? This is an important fundamental concept in Mahayana Buddhism. Instead of to even begin to comprehend what a Buddha is requires a realization of emptiness. Just a starting point. So that's very advanced realization. And it's generally understood that without the Buddha's teachings, we can't have any realization of emptiness. Tsongkhapa says that very explicitly in his famous text, The Essence of Eloquence. That's how he begins the text. He says, why do we need to question the Buddha's teachings? So he begins it with a quotation from the sutra. So it means the emptiness, signlessness, and wishlessness, essentially. These are the three, it's called the
Doors of liberation.
three doors of liberation. That's right. 3 doors of liberation. So by not knowing these, beings cycle in samsara. And so the Buddha, out of many methods and countless lines of reasoning, he taught the method to reach those. So Tsongkhapa begins the text this way, and then says, because we want to be free of samsara, we have to understand these three doors of liberation, which are all understandings of emptiness. So he says, but in order to understand them, we can't do so just on our own. So we have to rely on teachings that are valid. But in order to know what teachings are valid, because there's so many teachings, we have to rely on guides who can teach us which teachings, how to use our own reasoning to distinguish between a false and true teaching. And even within the Buddhist teachings, not that some are false, but some of them are provisional, it says. Some of them are actually the final intent of the Buddha. It's sort of similar to what I said at the earlier, that there's all kinds of Buddhist centers today. How do we distinguish which one is actually authentically repeating the Buddha's intention? But the same paradox comes in there, because the problem is, how do we know which guide to follow if we haven't actually had that realization? So if we can't have the realization of emptiness without first following the teachings, but we can't actually follow the teachings as a reasoned person until we realize emptiness, then there's never a possibility to begin.
There has to be a leap of faith for the student.
Yeah.
When you take refuge and study the Dharma, at some point there has to be a leap of faith. Then you entrust without really knowing.
I think to some extent, yes. I don't think it has to be so explicit. It's not like we get to a point where we say, well, I don't know, but I'm just going to do it. And not reason about this. But I think that's part of the process, is that it does require, it's more than pure reasoning, as I mentioned at the beginning. It's very helpful to meet teachers who embody these principles, such that we're not just reasoning in the dark.
Both have to go and go.
Both have to go and go.
Yeah, they have to go together. But another way to understand it is that that attitude is also something that we have to cultivate. very few people have that attitude of this reasoned approach when they first begin. And so our refuge will become deeper as time goes on. So it said that you don't have to know what a Buddha is, and you can't know what a Buddha is when you start. But you can know that certain aspects of what he said are valid, or at least seem valid, and are worth pursuing. Right? So even though the deeper aspects of it might not make a lot of sense now, or might seem quite esoteric, there are certain levels of it that we do have some ascertainment of. And so that's but then as time goes on, that our understanding of it gets deeper, and thereby our refuge also is going to get deeper. It's not like a yes or no. You either go for refuge or you don't. Right? And there's also, as I mentioned several times now, there's the imprints. Also, I think for some people, it's just natural because of training in previous lifetimes. Now, some of people who don't feel confident in that possibility, of course, that's also something to examine. But that's quite explicit anyway in the Buddhist texts themselves, that for some people, that is very strong. This talks about the four powers, right? In this context, the four powers is talking about the four causes for going to refuge or for entering the path, and one is one's own power, where it comes from your own initiative, and one is another's power, where a teacher is inspiring to you. Instead of the two, the first of those is more stable. And if the teacher is inspiring, but then they're no longer there, or if they are no longer inspiring to you, then it was not as stable. And then there's the power of cultivation, and the power of cause, which is talking about imprints from past lives. And it actually says of those two, the second is stronger. So people who have cultivated this in a past life, their refuge will be more stable than people who newly cultivate it now. But that doesn't just mean that it's hopeless, because of course, if you cultivate it now, in future life, it will be more natural. It's a new habit. Yes?
Imprints are a form of are karmic imprints.
Yes. Now, what is an imprint and how does karma work? That's another very big question, right? The different schools have different, very different. That's probably one of the biggest divisions in Buddhist schools, is trying to understand what is a karmic imprint. Right? The Buddhists very clearly stated that, but then exactly what it is and how does it function? That's a very different question. But the point here is that essentially it's habituation in the past. Right? This is an essential point in Buddhist philosophy. Anybody who's natural at anything, they'd say, it's mostly coming from previous imprints. Right? Nowadays, people might say it's genetic, but there's quite a lot of evidence that genetics don't play that big of a factor in skill sets, right? They have something to do with it, but people aren't just born as great musicians because their father was a great musician. And some people do seem to be born as great musicians, not literally. That's also an important point. It's not that the person just comes out of the womb and they already take refuge, just like they don't come out of the womb playing the violin. But the habitual pattern is there. So when they practice it, it just all falls into place quite naturally. Right?
It's also possible that because they were a musician in the past life, this night they are born to musician parents, so that they can.
Yeah, there's also that possibility, right? The past life is not the imprints from the past life aren't just affecting how they behave or their habitual tendencies in this life. It's also affecting what they encounter, right? For better or worse. And so people who we talked about finding the wrong path, whether somebody finds the right path, the wrong path, that has a lot to do with your karma. And even if their karma is very strong, then even if they meet the right teacher, they won't accept it. And if their karma is very positive, even if they meet the wrong teacher, they won't accept it. And so there's a lot of different things going on. There are different interplay of different conditions. Okay. So there's some other questions here, like, in order to go for refuge, do we have to know the whole Buddhist path? I think I already kind of touched on that point, that we don't have to know everything about it. And that it just wouldn't be possible. We have to start somewhere. We can't really get anywhere if we just think I'm going to learn all of it. I'm going to become a great Buddhist scholar, and then I'm going to decide whether or not I go for refuge. Right? There's something, say, sort of poetic about that. It is, in some sense, the approach we're taking, but in a not in a pure way. Right? We for example, at our monastery, as time goes on, we lose a lot more and more of our kind of, it's childhood faith, you could say. It is kind of naive faith. But at the same time, it's not just a purely intellectual process. As time goes on, we become more critical, but also because we have the stability to do so. Right? I know a lot of monks who leave the monastery, but I don't know of many cases, maybe there's a couple I can think of, but it's pretty unusual, where they leave because they were examining the Buddhist teachings and then they lost faith because they found it, they thereby found it to be in their minds incorrect. Right? Usually it's just, it's quite the opposite in most cases. They feel this, that actually this is a really worthwhile thing to do. I just can't do it. Something else, some kind of obstacle comes up. But nevertheless, as we develop, we become more able to ask these questions and not so afraid to ask them, because we feel quite stable and confident in our practice. There's things that we do feel confident enough about, that we know we have some ground, that we're not just going to lose the foundation entirely. That's the only way to really progress, is to go deeper, is to recognize what we're not certain about. So then the question about, is the Buddhist path efficacious? Is there such a thing as an enlightened being? It's always an important question to ask, and we might not have the tools to answer that right now. But I think there's a lot of questions that are related to that we have to think about. Right? I'm actually going to write an article about this sometime soon. Some of you might have seen, I wrote an article recently that was just put out in Mandala, not Mandala, they don't exist anymore, but FPMT News, about this idea of using reasoning. And I mentioned I would write a subsequent article because I really think this is useful to put all these ideas into one place. I often talk about them because there's a lot of steps along the way. So we have to think about if there's such a thing as enlightenment, well, and I mentioned this at the beginning of the talk, what things do we think make it impossible? Because a lot of people would dismiss it and say that it's a fantasy, that somebody could have that kind of realization. So why? What makes it impossible? So I have some ideas, but actually maybe that's a good opportunity to open it up if anyone has any suggestions.
Because in this, if we assume there's only one life in this life, we don't see that we're likely to develop those qualities.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So I think that's one of the important steps, is that we have to think about multiple lifetimes. I often say I don't accept this idea that I've heard this sometimes being taught. It tends to be more in Western countries where people don't naturally have a sense of confidence in reincarnation, in the sense that people will say, I accept the Buddhist teachings and I accept enlightenment, but I don't believe in reincarnation. But I understand, of course, the Buddhist teaching can be useful, even if you don't believe in reincarnation, for making your life a little bit more calm and mindful. But if we really talk about the kind of enlightenment that the Buddha was talking about, it doesn't make any sense. Right? But that, even more fundamental than that, then we say, well, if we assume there's only one life, the question is, why do we assume there's only one life? right? What has to be possible for there to be more than one life? It's quite a lot of things that we might assume that would get in the way of that. And so I think here, this is where it's really useful to think about science and the scientific worldview, because as much as I actually am very much in favor of science, more so now than I was when I first ordained, I think a lot of us today, the reason we might not accept this idea of reincarnation is things that we believe science has proven. And so it's useful to look at that. We might not know a lot about science, and we don't always all have to become experts in science, but if it's the case that we would justify it by saying, well, science has proven there's no reincarnation, then it's sort of our duty as Buddhists who want to follow this path to think about what about it proves that. If we don't understand science, well, then for one thing, it's a bit premature to say science has proven this if we don't understand how. But we might have some understanding of it and think about what is it that we understand that's contradictory to it, right? So I think some of the main things is, first of all, of course, the assumption that mind and brain are identical, or our mind is essentially a product of the brain. That being in terms of the psychological or biological obstacle, we could say. And then in terms of physics, right? Some people would argue that there's no possibility for non-material entities in the universe. Right? So both of those things are very important to look at. I don't think it's a distraction from practice. And practice is talking about analytical meditation, and this is analysis. This is critical thinking. And we do have to be careful not to just get, again, too intellectual. Well, we approach this in the context of our daily practice, right? We continue as Buddhist practitioners to do our daily practice. I think that's essential, right? Whatever you're experiencing, you never get to a point where you say, oh, it's more important that I just study all day without ever actually sitting quietly and reflecting on these things. And just being present with my mind, and also even actually maybe even more fundamental, just trying to practice compassion and trying to practice virtue day to day, right? So we have that foundation. But within that, when we have time to reflect on things, it's really good to reflect on these points. I'm not going to talk about them now because we don't have time. But as I mentioned, I will write an article later, and if someone wants to access that, it will hopefully be available. And then we talk about this, we talk about what is true Dharma, right? So Dharma has a lot of meanings, right? I think it's often argued that it really shouldn't be translated. It's usually not. In English, we usually say Dharma, right? Sometimes I've heard, at least in some older texts, they translate it as the law, the way, but none of those even be, what's that? The doctrine, yeah. The doctrine is even worse because it then limits it, right? The Dharma really, it says in Buddhism, the real Dharma is realization. It's not the doctrine, it's not the books. The real Dharma, when we go for refuge, the Dharma, it's going refuge to the truth of cessation and the truth of the path that leads to cessation, which are things that we're going to cultivate in our minds. Right?
So,
what?
So is it right to say I would my nature of reality impermanent?
Yeah, I mean, also it's the nature of reality in the sense, I mean, the word, so actually, yeah, we just talked about this earlier this year in our study of Abhidharma. It says in the Abhidharma Kosha by Vasubandhu, he says there's 10 different uses of the word Dharma, right? So, for example, an object of knowledge, that's the most basic one. And a Dharma. And then it's often used in Buddhist philosophy, the idea that all Dharmas, I mentioned this at the beginning, all things, it really says all Dharmas are empty and selfless. It's all phenomena, everything that exists. And then path is also a Dharma. So Shecha Lam Tang Ni, Nyang and De Tang. So then Nirvana is Dharma.
Responsibility of the Brahma.
Responsibility. Yeah, the colloquial sense, probably people use it that way, right? So there's many different ways people use the same term. So what we're talking about here, in terms of Dharma, is essentially the goal of the realization that we're trying to cultivate. And then conventionally, that can be understood as the teachings, because like if we want to make an altar, prostrate to the Dharma, it's very hard to just put the truth of cessation on the altar. So we put a text represents the Dharma, but it's important to not get it too attached to that as being the final Dharma. It talks about this in the Mahayana Sutra Lamkara, right? That it's known to be like a boat in the end. The boat takes you to the other shore, but it's not itself the opposite shore. You don't want to get attached to it as the goal. Right? So the Buddha even talked about this, the raft analogy. Right? It's like a man who crosses a river in a raft. When he gets to the other side, he doesn't just carry the raft around on his back, then it's just a burden. So the teachings are provisional. They lead you somewhere, but if we get too attached to the teachings, the word of the teachings, it's an obstacle. So the question here was, what is a true Dharma? And I think a number of things I would say is one, that it has clear structure and goals in terms of the teaching aspect of it, right? And that it accords with reality. That's really the most fundamental meaning of Dharma. And then realizing the Dharma means that you make your mind accord with the reality. Your mind becomes more in tune with the way things actually are. Because ultimately, it's about you, right? Dharma isn't just an object out there that we can talk about is so great, but it's Buddhist practice has to be about your own mind. And that's also something, sometimes we'll see people who change from one Buddhist tradition to another. That's a little different than changing religions, but it's true. There might be certain ways in which one Buddhist tradition is superior is not the right word, but maybe has different strengths than another. And none of them has all of them. I don't believe that. I follow Tibetan Buddhism, but I don't believe that Tibetan Buddhism is superior in every way to every other form of Buddhism. But my general feeling after years of observing this is that it's usually not very conducive to making progress to switch traditions. Because really it's ultimately about your own mind. Wherever you go, you're working with your own mind. And oftentimes, although it might not really seem that way, there seem to be very good reasons. The motivating factor might be that the person is being confronted with something difficult in their own mind, and thereby making this, basically a projection that it'll be different somewhere else. But wherever you go, you're with your own mind. And ultimately, you'll find problems with anywhere you go, any situation. So you go, you're here, and there's these problems, but there's somewhere else, and there's these problems, different problems. It doesn't mean that as you go to a Buddha center for the first time, and you should just say, "This is it. I'm not going anywhere else." It's sort of like we think about marriage, right? You can date different partners and think about who you want to marry, but once you commit to it, it's good to try to stick with that relationship. So when you're new to the practice, it can be very useful. And I did that myself. I went to a lot of different Buddhist teachers early on and spent time in different traditions. And I think that was also actually helpful. I think I would have been impoverished if I hadn't done that. And it's given me much more broader view of things over the years. And I still read a lot of books from other traditions. That's what my teacher was, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, told me that. I said, early on as a monk, I was thinking about maybe visiting some other monasteries, see how they're doing things there. And Rinpoche said, no, don't do that. But it's good, you can read about them. It's a lot more committal if you actually go there and take the time to do it. But when you read about it, it does broaden your mind. Gives you more insight into what you are doing here with your own tradition. And then finally, the refuge of the Sangha, right? Which is essential, and sometimes that can be overlooked. people think the Buddha is the great refuge, the Sangha, well, they're just ordinary people, so it's not so much of refuge. Now, really, if we talk about Sangha, really somebody who's true Sangha should be somebody who has a direct perception of emptiness or reality, and that's actually very advanced. But in a conventional sense, we can talk about Sangha as ordained people, a collection of ordained people, or even just in a more colloquial sense, as often used these days, is just your fellow practitioners. Now, we want to be careful not to just get too watered down about we say everyone's Sangha, but at the same time, it is actually useful to think about it that way, that then you're dealing with real people. Right? It's very nice to say, I completely surrender myself to the Buddha and then put it on the altar and make offerings. But then when you're around other people, act like you usually act, or find it difficult to be around people. This is our opportunity to actually practice, is when we're dealing with ordinary people, but not just anybody. It's people who have at least committed to the same goals as ourselves. That's something I really appreciate being in my monastery, and I think back on it again and again, because sometimes you can feel, because of course at first when we go to a monastery, everything seems very peaceful, but when we're there many years and years, we learn that everyone has their own hang-ups and whatever else. But then we reflect, at least we're all trying. There's nobody in the monastery, or at least very few people, if anybody, who does not have the motivation to overcome their anger, the motivation to follow the Buddha's teachings. So that's the big thing. We're all making effort in this, and we all have collectively agreed that we're trying to be better people, and we're trying not to get angry, and we're trying to apply antidotes to our afflictions. So that, I think I should stop there, because even if we've already gone over time, and even if we go till 2 hours, we should have some time for questions. And actually, we may have wanted done the meditation at the end, but let's have some questions first, and let's see how that goes. Yes.
So you spoke about having a goal and then finding the right path to get to the goal.
Yeah.
But then you also speak about how one should be in the here and now and be in the present.
Yes.
So I am often conflicted between these two things. Should I really enjoy my present and not focus so much on the goal where I'm not really truly living the present? Or if I don't focus on the goal, then I'm sort of lost. I don't know the goal.
Yeah, I think we need both. The question for those of you online also is about, if we just think about the goal, then are we not in the present, right? And had I maybe contradicted myself, perhaps, by saying we need to also be present in the here and now, we need both. I think we emphasize one more over the other, depending upon which one is lacking in ourselves, right? Now, there's something, I think it's also an important point to address. Right? This sense, people, I'm sure most of you know this term, and you even kind of alluded to it, be here now, right? As far as I'm aware, this term originated with Baba Ram Dass in the 60s, right? At the book, Be Here Now. I'm not aware of him taking that from any Buddhist source, although it might be incorrect. But the point is, that's become a very much understanding of Buddhism and also just a spiritual practice in general in pop culture, that we should just be here in the present moment. And that's, we don't want to be distracted by thinking about the future or ruminating about the past. And that is antithetical to spiritual practice. I think generally I feel that's a pretty big error. I do think in as much as it's saying we should not be always distracted, yes, I think that's great. I think that probably what Ram Dass, and I don't discredit him, and he seemed like he was a pretty sincere person. That I think his main point was that in that modern society, people are just always distracted. And it's much worse now than it was 60 years ago. And that's, I absolutely advocate that we should minimize our distraction and not have all kinds of stimulation from different media and from phones and all kinds of things that distract us. In that degree, we should be present. But in some sense, then that gives us the ability to go out of the present. Because when you're always checking your phone, you're never really thinking about what happened yesterday. It's always what's happening now. I need to make this situation and obsessing about making things better about whatever situation is going on now, but not reflecting on, well, what did I do last time this happened, and what kind of is this pattern just repeating itself over and over? Right. So in Buddhist practice, the past and the future are essential for our practice. We have to be grounded in both of them. So in the terms of the future, we do want to have a clear goal where we're going. That's why it says that to be a spiritual person means to be either thinking about future lifetimes or liberation or enlightenment. It has to have a goal that's in the future. And also the past is essential. We can only learn lessons about our own habitual tendencies from looking at the past. And our karma, although we might not remember all the details of our past lives, that's a quite different thing. But it's the same process. We want to look back at our life and what causes did we create, and what results they gave us. Look at this process when it talks about in the text. So we want to be mindful of sensations, right? So sometimes that's understood. Actually, usually I think nowadays it's understood as therefore we should feel every sensation on our body, right? Which is also a good thing to do. But I don't think that's actually what it meant in the sutra. It's talking about mindful of the way that certain actions lead to particular experiences in the future. So it's looking over a period of time, mindful of the way that karma functions even in the period of time that we do have access to. And then if we focus very strongly on that, that's what eventually leads to seeing into previous lifetimes as well, and seeing more deeply into that process. And I often mention that was exactly how the Buddha became enlightened. Right? We look at the Buddha's enlightenment experience; it involved remembering past lives. Right? So to say that Buddhists shouldn't worry about their past lives, now the Buddha did say very clearly, and this is an important distinction: we don't just talk about past lives and we don't actually remember them, and just like say, I think I was so and so, and that's not that important. But ultimately, we want to actually go very deeply into our own internal process, and that's going to tie into more than just this lifetime. So by being here now, we have the presence to do that, rather than being distracted by all kinds of external things that are tying up our mental space. So again, it's almost, again, it would be very, I think it takes a lot of experience with the path to kind of make the distinctions, right? It's very hard to say one way or the other. What does it mean to be here now? What does it mean to be present with our minds? Because there is other extremes, right? If you just ruminate about the past, that's not helpful, right? And if we're just stuck on some idea of something in the future that's very far away, that's very vague, that then distracts from actually making positive change now, then that can also be unhealthy.
So there should be a balance.
Yeah, it needs to be a balance, and I think we have to. There's different ways of it being that way, right? Somebody can be very, very focused on enlightenment, but it can be very positive. You have to look at the manifestation now. That's the main thing. You look at somebody's actions now, and the way that is it transforming to them now, then it's having a positive effect. But I think the main point I was just making now is that I think it's too difficult to just make a clear distinction. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of experience with spiritual practice to be able to see that clearly, and a lot of maturity. But it's good to talk about it and think about it and kind of know the direction we're trying to go into, because that could be an obstacle to have this fixated idea that I shouldn't be thinking about the past or the future. I should only be thinking about what's happening right now. Yeah. There's a question here. Would it be correct to say that the seed of the resultant refuge within your own continuum sprouts from the blessings of individual liberation vows? Yes, not 100%, but very much so. Yes. So, in case any of you don't know, individual liberation vows means if you take refuge as a Buddhist, for example, as a layperson, that is individual refuge, liberation from prakti moksha, Sanskrit, right? And then when we take monastic, yeah. So for lay people, then they have the 5 precepts that go along with them, right? The vow itself is not just the precepts; it's the taking refuge that's associated with that. And then we take monastic vows also. Those are individual liberation vows. It's one class of vows we talk about versus bodhisattva vows and tantric vows, which are other classes of vows within Mahayana Buddhism. But yeah, in order to achieve that, the individual liberation vows are, we'd say, nearly indispensable, not 100%. It's actually going to consider to be, it is possible to become enlightened without individual liberation vows. And the reason that's given is that to take individual liberation vows, pratimoksha vows, you have to be a human being. That's one of the prerequisites. I think most of you fulfill that, but the point is that it is understood that people who, as they advance in the practice, can be born as spiritual, as gods, if we say devas. And then they continue the path there, where they're no longer taking individual liberation vows because they're not qualified to do so, according to the Buddhist teachings. They still, if they're Mahayana practitioners, they can still have bodhisattva vows. But generally speaking, yes, for human beings, it's essential as a foundation. So it says there's 2 main results of individual liberation vows, which is that the temporal result, which is that you'll have a positive rebirth. And then the ultimate result is that you achieve enlightenment. So yes, that in that sense, that is the seed that will sprout the resultant refuge. But it's more than just that, right? That's the training in higher training in ethical discipline. Then we have the higher training in concentration and the higher training in wisdom, right? So we need to have those 2. Just simply taking individual liberation vows in and of itself isn't the final. I mean, it's going to be there the whole time. It's the foundation, but it's not the direct antidote to affliction. Yes.
So in the foundation of all good quality, is it assumed you're already taken refuge before starting the, because it doesn't mention refuge or spiritual therapy. Starts with Guru.
Yeah, it does. Namdak Sampadehi Trampahi, Danachichabayo Chempuhi, Dambitsa was Susa Tarpala, Drupa Jinkito. So, well, the word refuge is not there, but it says, so it's maybe the 7th verse. It says, based on that pure thought, mindfulness and alertness and great caution arise. The root of the teachings of keeping the pratimoksha vows, please bless me to accomplish this essential practice. Right, so it's talking about the pratimoksha vows. So, for when one takes lay vows as a lay person, Ganyan, so what is it? Upasaka vows. Then that is also the ceremony of refuge, right? So like when you take refuge, although they're 2 separate things. If you do the refuge ceremony, you first take refuge and then you do a separate section of the ceremony where you're taking the precepts. But it is one ceremony. So I think that is where it's referring to it, right? But at the same time, it's sort of, as I said before about the Lamrim, that it's presented in that order, but for an individual practitioner, it's not like you first realize guru devotion, and then you realize death and impermanence, then you realize about karma, and then you think about suffering, and then you take refuge, right? Really, as Buddhist practitioners, you might do that quite a bit earlier. But it's just saying in terms of the progression of how to do that. A refuge, really, a very strong refuge is going to be based on those previous things. Now, to put in the guru devotion first, that's unique to Tsongkhapa, as I understand it, that was something that his innovation, because that's so fundamental. But of course, that's a kind of refuge. We talk about relating properly to a spiritual teacher is very much part of the refuge attitude that we're cultivating. But then if we really want to have that refuge, then cultivating not remembrance of, what is it? First of all, the perfect human rebirth, and then death and impermanence, and then the results of karma, and then it's contemplating on the dissatisfactory nature of samsara. So yeah, I think those are what's going to then make the foundation for going for refuge. Now, and I mentioned also, of course, there's the compassion aspect of it. The one, as I said, that in the context of wanting to make the world a better place. So if we think about the Mahayana path, then of course that also becomes part of our foundation for refuge. All of it can play into it. I hope I answered your question. I don't.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. It's a bit of a tangent also, but is there any further questions? I think it's already getting quite a bit later than the scheduled time. Now, I think I mentioned Venerable Legdon had said we could do a meditation at the end, but not necessary. And I think having a formal guided meditation on refuge might be a bit much now, but let's just do something very brief. So we can just again sit quietly like we did at the beginning. And then we'll just do a few reflections of what we've talked about today. Okay, so I guess we can just take a moment to think about what are the different ways that we experience suffering in our lives? First, think about that. Because that's what's motivating many of our actions, is to change that. So what are the things? What are the physical, psychological? What are the fears that we have? What are the things that affect us day to day? Just take a few moments to reflect on that. Now we can reflect on what do we usually do when we experience that suffering, or when those thoughts come into our mind. How do we react? Where do we turn? Not where should we turn, but look at where do we turn? How do we usually habitually respond? Then we can think about, is there a better direction that we can go? Is there something that can free us more permanently, that will be more stable or more reliable? This thinking about the qualities of the Buddha and the Dharma of the Sangha community. Just sometimes it can be helpful. We do a real meditation on this, which we don't have time for now. It's good to also recite the refuge. And then as we're reciting it, we can think about it. I won't do this now also because I don't know if everyone has formally taken refuge, but for yourself, if you like to, you can. You can recite a little bit. I go for refuge to the Buddha, or recite in whatever language is useful for you, and then try to, in your mind, think about what would it mean? What is the melted state that we're trying to cultivate by saying that? Okay. Well, okay, so thank you, everybody. I guess we should do the dedication verses here. And are we? I think page 36, right? Due to these merits of these virtuous actions, may we attain the state of a Guru Buddha, lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow. And may that has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good, all powerful Chenre, Zik, Tenzin, Gyatso. Please remain until samsara ends. Now for Kyabje Lama Zopa Rinpoche. For some time we were reciting the swift return prayer, but actually now we don't recite that anymore because he has returned according to His Holiness. So we don't have a particular prayer to recite, but we can pray that the unmistaken reincarnation of Kyabje Lama Zopa Rinpoche might be recognized and most importantly be free of obstacles to continuing manifesting the enlightened qualities of his predecessor or her predecessor, we don't know. And to develop in this life, and that we might also continue to be under their care in this and many future lifetimes. Okay, thank you. Just in time to dedicate. Okay.
Can I just
Yeah, please.
remind everyone that we also have teachings also online. So yeah, I'd just like to remind everyone that we also have teachings tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock?
Oh, 10 o'clock.
At 10 o'clock, yeah. On Practical Buddhism for Everyday Life, offered by Venerable Gache, tomorrow 10 o'clock, online and in person. Thank you so much for attending. And thank you, Venerable Gache.
Yeah, thank you. Apologies again for the late start today. Now I know tomorrow at 10.